Democratic leader in history. Leadership elections will be held at the end of next week. David Hyde, KUOW News.
The debate over whether Seattle Public Schools should resume its school resource officer program is getting louder this week.
Our kids deserve to be safe when they go to school.
Resource officer program is getting louder
After school.
That's Victoria Beach, chair of the African American Community Advisory Council for SPD, sound courtesy of King 5 News. Her group hosted a public meeting last night to talk about school officers following last week's deadly shooting at Ingraham High. Superintendent Dr. Brent Jones says there are no immediate plans to reinstate the program. This is KUOW.
Support for NPR comes from Charles Schwab. With a variety of financial planning options, from online tools to meeting with a financial consultant, Schwab works to make it easy to plan for tomorrow today. More at schwab.com/plan.
Welcome to Friday. Welcome to Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke, KUOW's Bill Radke, host of the program. And there would be no program if it weren't for our always excellent panel of journalists, which today I'm talking about insider tech correspondent Katherine Long. Hi, Katherine.
Hey.
Publicola co-founder and editor Erica Barnett. Hi, Erica.
Hello.
Geekwire contributing editor Mike Lewis. Hi, Mike.
Hey, Bill.
Good to have you all along with us. And you can watch the show if you like it that way. YouTube and Facebook streams the show. And if you miss any of it, you really didn't, because it's on the podcast. Just go over to KUOW.org. And so lots of ways to enjoy the program. Before we start, fans of Week in Review, please come out with us for a live year in review at McCaw Hall in 4 weeks, Thursday evening, December 15th. A great panel of journalists plus special guests, including, I just got confirmation yesterday, who was the biggest upset winner in the congressional election?
Marie Glusenkamp-Perez.
On stage with us. She's our person of the year 2022. And yeah, she's going to be fascinating to meet. I'm looking into whether we can have her fell a tree on stage or fix my carburetor, but we'll definitely talk. Exactly. Yes, but politics for sure. And more special guests too. I'll tell you more about that later in today's show. You can find details and tickets at KUOW.org/events and come out and see us. Okay. Our first topic, Katherine Long, you are exactly who I want to hear from on our first topic. As I say, you cover the tech industry, you cover Amazon, and apparently Amazon doesn't just hire people. They also are capable of laying people off, like maybe 10,000 this holiday season. And the CEO says maybe more next year.
Yeah, it turns out Amazon has been the great shrinking tech giant this week. It's been a tumultuous week to be an Amazon worker. The New York Times reported on Monday that Amazon plans to lay off about 10,000 corporate employees. That's about 3% of its corporate workforce. So in the context of other tech layoffs we've seen at Facebook, for instance, a relatively small layoff, but that's still 10,000 people. And for those folks and for other Amazon employees here in Seattle and elsewhere, it's been really sort of a wild ride. I think a lot of Amazon employees would characterize it as opaque and frustrating. There wasn't any communication from leadership after the publication of the New York Times article that left them sort of scrambling to talk to each other, try to share information and figure out what was going on, which divisions would be affected, which ones would be safe. And by the time the dust had all settled, it seemed like most of the cuts this week were made in Amazon's devices division. That's home to Alexa, the virtual assistant, as well as Luna, the video game streaming platform. Human resources recruiters were offered voluntary buyouts, and there were some cuts also in other divisions. More cuts to come after Thanksgiving in the retail division. That's Amazon's e-commerce organization.
And why? I want to hear questions from my other panelists too, but first blush, why is this happening and why is it happening now?
Amazon and other tech giants, they grew really fast in the pandemic. They staffed up, they expanded quickly. Amazon in particular, we're not entirely sure how many corporate employees it added in the past 2 years, but all told, its headcount roughly doubled between 2020 and 2022. Most of that headcount was probably in the warehouses, but I think it's safe to say that Amazon added a lot of corporate employees in the last couple of years. As the economy has grown a little bit more uncertain, Amazon founder Jeff Bezos told people to, quote, batten down the hatches last month. Amazon is looking forward, seeing where it can cut. Alexa, which reportedly loses about $5 billion a year, is probably a pretty good place if you want to focus on parts of your business that are actually making money.
I'm curious, during the pandemic and before that too, I mean, it seemed like Amazon really got into a lot of lines of business that were not sort of its base. So like, I'm thinking of bookstores, which was pre-pandemic, those started closing. Some of these kind of side products like the fitness tracker that doesn't
Amazon
have any screen.
Halo.
Yeah. I mean, there's just all these things that I was kind of thinking like, what are they doing? And are they setting themselves up to be like Peloton? By sort of pushing out all this stuff that people might be interested in during the pandemic, but it seems pretty experimental.
Totally. I mean, I had the same thought, and I went through a bunch of the projects that Amazon rolled out during the pandemic. Amazon Explore, this travel experiences program that was actually virtual. Not sure who used that. The Halo watch that you mentioned, there were some other initiatives that Amazon rolled out. And I'm sort of thinking like, who are these for? Who's using these? And a lot of those projects got cut. Another one that comes to mind is Amazon Amp, the live radio streaming platform that faced pretty severe cuts in the past week as well.
Live radio. Who cares?
Yeah, really. What was the? It felt to me like when I was watching all of these happen, and of course we did a bunch of stories on this as well at Geekwire. It felt to me like the communication from the top was either non-existent or very indirect about what was going on. And what was your impression of how well it was communicated and what was happening? Because everyone in this room probably has a friend or a relative who works there in downtown, or maybe doesn't. I certainly do. And they felt like it was unnecessarily, like it created an enormous amount of tension that was unnecessary if it had just been communicated a little better.
I think that's exactly right. That's what I heard from a ton of Amazon employees, people who spoke to me directly, as well as nearly 20,000 Amazon workers who joined a Slack channel to discuss these layoffs in the absence of any communication from leadership. That channel was created, I think, around Tuesday morning. And by 2 days later, there were 20,000 people in it. Thursday, HR had to shut it down because it got so, rambunctious in there. But folks were expressing a lot of anger about the lack of communication. They said, the S team, Amazon's senior leadership team, the executives who set the direction for the company, had lost a lot of trust.
As I said earlier, I asked some of our listeners in our community feedback club, is this affecting you personally, your business? Got a bunch of responses. Nikki in South Seattle's nodding tag and says, will this become a pattern? I'm a college student entering the STEM field. Will it be an issue when I graduate? Which gets at this, is this just, interest rates are high and they hired like crazy, and we'll talk more about this probably in our year in review show, but how much of a blip versus a systemic new normal does this seem like?
Well, I think something that's interesting is that even though we've been seeing layoffs in the tech sector, the overall labor market is still quite strong. And there are a lot of tech jobs out there, even if they're not, at Amazon right now. Maybe this listener who's about to graduate college, this listener and others like them, who are graduating with degrees in STEM, I suspect that some of them may end up taking jobs at, non big five tech companies that still need to hire tech talent.
I think that's an excellent point. If you look at the overall job numbers, it's not as bad as it would seem because we're paying a lot of attention. And it's not just Amazon laying off, right? There's layoffs happening in the tech sector across the board. But if you look at how rapidly, I mean, especially if you're in college now, you've seen nothing but a boom time in tech, right? I mean, you've seen that dates back years. And now we're getting it's more of a leveling off really than it is. It's a slowdown of the expansion rather than a complete retreat, right?
Yeah, I think that's totally right. If you look at how many people these companies hired in the past 2 years, even these reductions still leave them with a lot more people than they started with before the pandemic.
A listener named Pat in Greenwood says, I work for a large local tech company. We're definitely impacted. Employees are anxious. I'm seeing signs of depression. The layoffs on top of the lower stock market and an uptick in physical illnesses are taking their toll on many of the people I work with. You told me there's a freak out guide circulating. Is that just an Amazon thing or in general?
Well, I don't know how employees at other tech companies are handling this, but yes, this week I did learn how to handle a layoff like an Amazonian. One of the resources that Amazon employees were sharing amongst each other was something called a freak out response form, a FERF. This is sort of a one-page document that is intended to help people who are experiencing kind of an overwhelming work situation, get to the root cause of what's causing them anxiety and figure out a way to move forward. I should say for the record that this is an unofficial Amazon document.
Yeah.
It was developed by an Amazon employee, but it's been getting a lot of play internally in recent days.
Don't catastrophize. Do you really know what's going to happen?
Yeah, exactly. And it also asks employees to look inward. How are things maybe like imposter syndrome or a sense of comparing yourself against other people, maybe playing into making a sense of anxiety a little bit more overwhelming than potentially it actually is.
Sounds like a one-pager on cognitive behavioral therapy.
That's exactly what was my response. That's what it is. That's good advice. I mean, you could, the FERF is classic name for it, but it's pretty good. I got laid off when the 2008, real estate bubble and the recession. I was in Los Angeles working for a public radio show, and instead of, and my wife was pregnant and we were underwater in our mortgage. We had just bought a house and our house was worth far less, you name it. And rather than freak out, it's as if I read the FERF, because first of all, I really did. I tried to empathize with the people who were still on the ship, and they were sort of underwater on their show and felt bad about it. And I acknowledged that. And another is I said, I hope you'll replace me with John Moe, because he's fantastic. And which they did. And they were basically impressed with my composure. And I think it helped that because of that, the same company hired me to host Marketplace Morning Report not long after, which was more fun and better paying. And so I'm not saying it always works out that way, obviously.
Right.
But the cognitive behavioral therapy advice of, well, wait a second, this is a moment in time, and what do you know and what don't you know, and what's this really about? I think it's good advice.
I think so too. I mean, just as a quick aside, when I was laid off from the Post-Intelligencer in 2009, the whole 95% of us were laid off in one fell swoop when no one was hiring journalists anywhere. One of the weird things, it was handled, I mean, Hearst itself didn't handle it so great, but our individual human resources director I ended up being like close friends. This is the person who laid me off, who literally delivered the message. And I think that there is a way to get through this situation if you can. I mean, it was in a bad way for me also financially when that happened. But to your point, that sort of ability to adjust your own response to it can hopefully pay off in some sort of dividend down the road.
Isn't somebody going to say that's tone deaf and good for you? You're privileged? Because I feel like there's people who are really suffering right now at the holiday season. In fact,
I wasn't going to say exactly that.
Okay. Well, I'm looking at a note from Tom in our feedback club. Tom says, how about talking about the fact these layoffs are being perpetrated by billionaire CEOs 5 weeks before Christmas? How about discussing the morality and ethics of these billionaire SOBs who pay less income tax than any of their workers?
Yeah, I mean that's a sentiment that I saw echoed a lot in this Amazon Slack channel, certainly. And some to your earlier point, Bill, something that also really struck me was that so many of these people who are being laid off are immigrant workers who are here on H-1B visas. So in addition to being laid off, they need to find a new employer to sponsor their visa, and if they can't, then they may need to uproot their lives, uproot their families, and leave the country. So yeah, it is a tough situation for a lot of folks. It's
real. Okay, this is a sort of an easy segue, I have to say, to our next topic, because Erica, you've been covering, I assume this is a related story, government budget cuts. I mean, we've got a slowdown happening, maybe a recession. What's the relationship?
Yeah, well, I mean, governments, as we all know, run on taxes, and taxes come from things like retail sales. But, they also come from things like, in the case of Amazon, the payrolls that they pay to all these workers, particularly highly paid tech workers. There's a relatively new tax called the Jumpstart tax, which is explicitly on the largest companies, and in particular on Amazon. It's highest on companies with revenues over $1 billion. And so that, as Amazon lays people off, that payroll is going to lower, the Jumpstart tax revenues are going to lower. That's in the future. Right now, what's happening is the city this year faced $141 million shortfall that just got a little bit bigger because of revenue forecasts into 2023, 2024. And that's all from all different kinds of taxes: business taxes, payroll taxes, retail taxes, sales taxes. And so when that happens, the city has to cut. That means cutting government services. That means usually not cutting police, but cutting things like spending on homelessness, spending on all kinds of goods and services, or services that the city is used to, that people in the city are used to having funded. So we're not going to get new parks this year. We're not going to get all kinds of new things that were kind of expected. Community center expansions, library seismic upgrades. There's tons of stuff that's on the chopping block. The way that the city did the budget this year and the way the city council is proposing to do its balancing package, it's mostly going to fall on new programs. So it's going to be things that, community centers that will not be upgraded, things that we thought were going to happen this year. But, the forecast does not look good in 2023, 24, 25, and 26 either. So what we're seeing now is just the beginning of what will probably be cuts that could turn into layoffs at the city, and more severe cuts that we'll start really noticing in those out years.
What's going to happen with the Harrell administration and its response to this? Because I think this is, whenever a city faces this sort of significant of a shortfall, you find out very, very quickly what their actual priorities are.
Yeah, right? I mean, in this budget, Harrell did propose not spending some money on police officers. It's a little confusing, but the police department kind of gets refunded every year, even if the budget director, even if the budget cuts the funding for certain positions. So there's 120 positions, and Harrell did say, look, we're not going to fund those positions. Some of that money went back into the general fund. But, most of the stuff that Harrell wanted to fund was like more spending on homeless sweeps, more spending on, other aspects of public safety, spending on graffiti, a gunfire protection, or a gunfire detection system. So those are Harrell's priorities. Now, a lot of that's not going to get funded now because the forecast is even worse than, the city thought before. But I think that says a lot about his priorities.
Totally. And what do you think it does in terms of tension between the mayor's office and the city council now that there is going to be this, I think, enthusiastic discussion about what's going to be cut?
I think it's been really interesting to watch this mayor in contrast with the previous mayor, Jenny Durkin, because the relationship with the council was the worst I've ever seen it in more than 20 years of covering the city. The relationship between the council and Harrell, who was formerly council president, longtime council member, has been really good. And I think it's still pretty good, way better than with Durkin. But I think there's a lot of tension over this issue of City Council Budget Chair Teresa Mosqueda has proposed getting rid of 80 police positions that will never be funded, but just getting rid of those funding pockets permanently. Harrell doesn't want to do that. Some of his allies on the council are calling that a cut to police, a return to police defunding, which it is not. But, it is going to be a big source of tension over the next week that they have at this point, or less than a week to hammer out the budget
over the next several years, potentially. I mean, depending on how this plays out.
Yeah. I mean, if they end up saying we're not going to fund these police positions that, that you want to keep sort of milking for other purposes and, grabbing to fund other things in the police department, that's going to be an issue that keeps coming up in the future when the mayor can say, well, when you defunded the police, you eliminated these, the spending that I could have spent on all these other priorities, including police.
Katherine, is Amazon going to say, well, I guess we'll lay off those high paying workers who you slapped a payroll tax on. This is how we'll react to your Jumpstart tax. Do they get political like that?
They they have gotten a little testy about previous attempts to tax their payroll. I don't foresee that happening in this instance. I think Amazon is more focused on trying to right its own ship and getting into a fight with city council at this point.
I mean, I think too, when they tried to do that a couple of years ago with the city council races, it backfired on them spectacularly and they lost all their races. So they've realized that's not a very good strategy and it's also a waste of money.
But does anyone have a sense? I know, Erica, you've written about this, and Katherine, I think you probably have at least brushed up against this quite a bit. The whole idea of downtown sort of revitalization and what happened now with less money being spent on a variety of things in downtown, or potentially less money being spent, certainly potentially fewer workers down there, because remember, it's not just Amazon making layoffs. All the businesses associated that sort of are dependent on these folks, and expected to some degree that these people were coming back, setting aside the fact so many people working remotely now. I mean, does it feel to either of you like this is rolling into a very, very permanent change in what downtown is?
Well, I will just point out that there's the Macy's building is now home to a new anchor tenant, Uniqlo, as of, I think, tomorrow. So I think that there's always a panic about downtown.
Right.
And there has been, since department stores started to decline 20, 30 years ago. I think that it may change in character a little bit, but I do think those storefronts are going to fill. They may fill with different types of tenants. They may, fill with government subsidized arts tenants, which I think would be great.
Right.
But I don't think that
if there's a government subsidy to be had.
Sure, but that's a cheap investment relative to a lot of other things we spend our money on. I mean, almost a quarter of the budget of the general fund budget goes to police.
Right.
And in fairness, I mean, the city of Seattle is funding, things like that. And the Jumpstart tax does fund, organizations like small businesses. So I think the character will change, but I think it's way too soon to start, sounding the death knell for downtown.
Okay. Before we take a break, can I ask you one related question, Katherine? Since returning, working from home versus office came up, does a shrinking, I know that's an exaggerated word, a leveling off tech sector and more competition, and here you've got Elon Musk saying, you got to work from home and all this. Will there be more? Do you think that in 2023 there'll be less freedom to work from home?
I certainly think that to a certain degree, the balance of power has shifted back in the direction of tech employers to demand things of their employees. Mm-hmm. When the tech hiring market was red hot, when you had these big tech companies competing tooth and nail for the top talent, remote work was definitely something that everybody felt that they had to give. And even just a couple of time moves strangely these days. Maybe I think this was last month. Amazon directed a bunch of its trucking sort of crisis center operatives to immediately return to work in the office in their Phoenix location. I got amounts of angry phone calls from Amazon employees about that. Mm-hmm. But even still, Amazon was only asking them to work in the office a couple of days a week. So I think, hybrid work is certainly here to stay. That's not news at this point, but it's something that bears repeating.
We've got to take a break. It kind of leads us into our next topic, Mike, because preventing school shootings cost money as well. Right? We're going to talk about that call and the city response when we return here. More on Week in Review in just a moment.
94.9 KUOW Seattle. It's 12:29. Sunny and 48 degrees in Seattle. Going to be a sunny afternoon, at least until sunset at 4:29.
Hi, I'm Rashad Brown, KUOW's Director of Membership. I'm often asked how exactly public media is funded. Contrary to what the hashtag defund NPR folks think, stations like KUOW actually receive very little government dollars. Most of our support comes from listeners like you and local businesses who believe an informed public makes our community stronger. Learn more about KUOW's funding and how it's put to work at kuow.org/support.
Support for KUOW comes from the Metropolitan Improvement District in partnership with the Downtown Seattle Association. Property owners within the Metropolitan Improvement District are focused on keeping downtown Seattle clean, safe, and welcoming 7 days a week. Learn more at downtownseattle.org/mid.
You're listening to KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke with our journalist panel here, Publicola co-founder and editor Erica Barnett, Insider tech correspondent Katherine Long, and Geekwire contributing editor Mike Lewis. Mike, we learned more this week about the high school senior shot to death at Seattle's Ingraham High School last week with a Glock 32 after an argument. There's a 14-year-old boy in juvenile detention charged with murder and assault for shooting at another student. A 15-year-old boy arrested with him on a Metro bus, charged with rendering criminal assistance, both charged with unlawful possession of a firearm because they're so young. And Mike, some Seattle students rallied to demand more from the city and the school system. What is it they want?
That's it's not a matter of what they want. There's a variety of competing wants here. There's a whole bunch of different responses to things like this, and it's not just in Seattle. It's in a variety of cities where this has happened. I mean, one of the odd twists prior to this was that the schools had canceled the community service school resource officers.
Yes.
And the school resource officers ostensibly were there for these sort of situations. You have somebody, a sworn officer on campus, who can actually engage on the front end. Maybe somebody hears something's going on, maybe somebody sees something, and then that can maybe prevent things from happening. In this particular case, that person was not available on campus, although there is an open discussion and argument as to whether or not that would help. I think right now at that high school, there is a strong feeling that it should be that you should have the resource officers back on campus, on high school campuses throughout Seattle.
But remind us why they were generally taken away.
Money. I mean, it's the idea. Well, there's two things: money, and there has been some institutional pushback about having cops on campuses.
Right.
Two things going on. And this is the complicated nature of high school, whether or not you have that on campus, and that is something you want to project as campus is not being a safe and secure place, so we have to have metal detectors and officers there. Or do we acknowledge that these sort of situations can happen? This is I think this is a very difficult problem for schools to solve. Logistically, it's a difficult problem, primarily because how do you cover high schools are designed in these open platform that allows for a lot of entrances and exits. It allows for a lot of open windows, things like that make putting in metal detectors. If you were to look at school experts about whether metal detectors help, you would think that it would be universally, everyone would say yes, and it's actually not true. And in fact, this argument, I think at Oxford High School in Detroit, is going on right now, whether or not they need metal detectors at every possible opening in a school. And this is the type of discussion that's happening now with Ingraham High School here in Seattle.
Well, I think that the students were asking more for mental health resources and gun safety measures, not for cops at schools. I mean, my understanding of why they cut the school resource officers was that it was largely, I mean, it was a budget issue, but it was largely because the fact, or the perception anyway, that police officers at schools have not prevented school shootings. I mean, look at the response in Uvalde. I mean, there's, a tremendous number of police officers just standing around doing nothing. And a pretty, hardened school, metal detectors, as you've said, have not been proven to be particularly effective. So I think that, there is a push for mental health resources. I think actually the city council has been responding to that in sort of last minute budget discussions. I think the fact is you can't harden a school enough. And in this particular case, I mean, it wasn't sort of a random mass shooter. It was interpersonal conflict.
Targeted,
yeah. So, I mean, I think
it was student. It followed a fight among students,
and I think the fact that you have a 14-year-old, the fact that the perpetrator here is, the alleged perpetrator here is 14 years old. I mean, just speaks really to the fact that you can't just treat this as a criminal justice and a more policing and a public safety issue, because this is a child with a child's brain and a child's understanding of consequences, and I don't see any way out of that type of situation other than mental health resources and getting help for kids to understand the consequences of actions like this, and the fact that like the consequences are permanent.
Speaking of the alleged assailant's age, I know there's been some discussion of potentially charging this person as an adult. Where does that stand?
It's not been decided yet whether or not that's going to happen, and that is going to be a secondary. I mean, among the many debates in this is, and I think to Erica's point, you're dealing with a child here, and so what does a 14-year-old cognitively? What does a 14-year-old? How does a 14-year-old qualify as an adult? Well, I don't know. In the juvenile justice system, sometimes the mental state of the 14-year-old is irrelevant. They want to charge an adult crime, a kid with an adult crime, because it was, it's a homicide, right? But in this particular case, I would say also with the community resource officers, I think you're right. I mean, it's been an open debate whether or not these help, although here's always been the statistical pushback on that, is we actually don't know when they do help because nothing happens, right? In other words, there's not these statistical samples are so small at any individual high school that who knows if in some case, and I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily scientifically accurate, but it's very difficult to say to statistically account for a non-event, right?
Which is when I think you should listen to kids. I mean,
right.
like
Absolutely.
when kids are saying, this is what we need, and this is what my friends need, and this is what I need.
Right.
I mean, that those voices actually should matter, even though, or I would say because they are the immediately impacted people.
But also you've got issues with how do teachers in this particular case, we had a teacher, like there was some awareness that there was a very agitated kid on campus. Now, do they see this every day and they can't react to all of them? Perhaps, I don't know. I mean, none of that is very clear in the story itself. But there was a group of kids who got in a fight with a kid trying to take away the gun, at least allegedly, according to the Seattle Times story. What was the gap in the period of time? Did any of these kids go to anyone, either, there's no community service officer, but to a teacher and say like, hey, there's a kid with a gun, right? Because this played out over a period of time. This didn't play out in 10 seconds, right? And I'm kind of wondering what happened there and why wasn't there a resource available, or at least a procedure available, where these kids themselves would report on a kid who they knew had a handgun at school.
I think this also gets back to, the larger question of what's going to happen with the juvenile detention facility. I think this is going to be fodder, and maybe fairly so, for people who say, look, there are some crimes that we have to take that child out of society and put them somewhere where they cannot cause harm. And I'm not a proponent or not a proponent of that view in this case. I just, I'm not an expert enough to have a super informed opinion. However, I mean, I think that this is the kind of case people are talking about when they say we need a juvenile detention facility. King County Executive Dal Constantine has set a timeline for closing down the youth jail, which just opened very recently. A new facility opened that was supposed to be kind of a more compassionate version of a jail, but it is still a jail. And so the question is, can we replace that with some sort of other confinement or facility or home where kids can, simultaneously be treated and helped and given an education and treated compassionately, but also, without sort of saying we're going to completely abolish the practice of taking kids who commit horrific crimes and impactful crimes out of society for a while, as punishment and protection for people who, are on the outside. So, I don't have a solution in that debate, but this is going to impact that debate for sure.
Absolutely. And let's just say, for example, and what's also going to be a factor in this, to your point, is if this 14-year-old is tried as a juvenile, that 14-year-old is released at 21 years old in Washington state. Now, I'm not suggesting whether or not that is a good or a bad thing, but what I am saying is if you're the parent of a kid who was a victim, you're going to feel very, very strongly that maybe that shouldn't be the case because you're certainly without a kid, right?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, there are kids who, there are parents and, impacted people who participate in restorative justice programs. Not everybody. I mean, it's not a monolithic, like, I want to lock this person up forever.
I understand it's not monolithic. And that wasn't my point. My point was more that if you are a parent and you have your 17-year-old was killed at a high school, and then 7 years later this other kid's out, there are going to be parents who are going to find a way to maybe it through restorative justice. But there are also going to be people right now at the immediate term when these decisions are being made who are maybe not going to be as comfortable with that. And I'm not suggesting one way or the other is the appropriate way. I'm just saying that this issue at high school, which is just by itself a tragic event, is going to spin out in a variety of big decisions that are going to be highly pressurized moving ahead. And listening to kids, I think, is absolutely a super important component, but it's not the only component.
Okay, we've got to move on. So there's a few things that are going to be ongoing. The court case against these two, and so far juvenile detention. We talked about the bigger picture, Juvenile Justice Center, and we've got it. Meanwhile, the city and county, but these are partly budget decisions. So all that is going on. I want to move to a less awful but still public safety issue, Erica, which is that if your favorite pedestrian intersection doesn't have a crosswalk, you can make one. The design and color scheme are quite simple and replicable, and this is happening. Some Seattleites doing DIY CWs. So I assume the city is thanking them for safeguarding walkers at no taxpayer expense.
Yeah, quite the contrary. So there was an attempt at some tactical urbanism, I would call it, which is
tactical urbanism.
I mean, I didn't make this up. I'm not going to take credit for it, but this is an example of that, where some people painted a crosswalk in an intersection they painted a crosswalk at a crosswalk. Because every single intersection in the state of Washington is a crosswalk.
Because pedestrians have right of way, correct. And this is actually a crosswalk where SDOT had gone in and created wheelchair ramps and indicated, this is where you're supposed to cross. But there's no painted crosswalk. So some folks came in, painted one, I assume in the night. And the Seattle Department of Transportation very, very swiftly went out and started power washing it away. And this got noted on Twitter, and it turned into a big blow up because the Seattle Department of Transportation then came in and said that it is dangerous to have a crosswalk, because a painted crosswalk that was not authorized and that didn't go through the whole Seattle process, because it confuses drivers and it creates a false sense of safety for pedestrians. Why false? I mean, you just told me that the pedestrian is legally safe, quote unquote. It has the right of way. So
yeah.
Why would a painted crosswalk make anyone less safe?
Well, a lot of people ask that question on Twitter, including me. And this SDOT did not provide any kind of response to that. They just sort of, in a series of really wild, unforced errors, I would say. Just kind of being familiar with how Twitter works, doubled down and said, this is just absolutely, we did the right thing. And if you want to participate in the process, you can go to public meetings, and people, on Twitter, there are a lot of people who are very involved with pedestrian safety and advocacy. And they spoke up and said, look, I've done this. I've gone to a zillion public meetings. I started asking for you guys to repaint a crosswalk that you painted because it's gone now. 6 years ago, and now my kids are grown up and have driver's licenses, and and you haven't done it. So this process doesn't work, and we're telling you it doesn't work, and that's why this happens. And then the director of SDOT, again, just a wild, I would call unforced error, jumped in and started, calling people disingenuous and saying that somebody, was engaging in dangerous disinformation, like just a person on Twitter, and it was so fascinating to watch, because it was just like the worst PR response you could possibly imagine. And as I pointed out on Publicola, meanwhile, the Department of Transportation, which is responsible for the right of way, allows eco blocks to be placed, which are these big concrete blocks to prevent RVs from parking.
Right.
There are thousands of them that individual businesses and individuals have placed all over the city. They're illegal. But SDOT has done nothing. And actually, Greg Spotts, the new director of SDOT under Bruce Harrell, said that they are going to continue to do nothing in order to prioritize other safety concerns, unspecified, about these eco blocks. So there's a real contradiction there, in my mind, and in a lot of people's mind.
Prioritize other safety concerns like pressure washing off these crosswalks. I certainly have had the impulse to paint a gorilla crosswalk in my neighborhood, more than one. It's really frustrating to be walking down the street, try to cross at a crosswalk, know that I have the right of way, and to see a car refuse to stop for me. You know, it happens multiple times a day.
So it's basically rectangular graffiti as far as the city's concerned.
Well, and what's also, and I'll shut up on this in a second. I mean, I could soapbox for the next 15 minutes, which I won't. But I mean, what's also, you know, very like just frustrating about this is that, you know, when people take things into their own hands, you would think that the city would listen. And I think in the past, the city has listened. There have been neighborhoods that have, you know, done the same thing, essentially painted crosswalks, one in the Central District. There's a Pan-African flag, one in on Capitol Hill. There was a rainbow flag.
Mm-hmm.
And SDOT at the time and the Department of Neighborhoods came in and said, you know what, like, this is great. They're not up to standard though. They don't have reflective paint or whatever. So we're going to go in and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to do this for you because there's a need there. And that's what used to happen. There was a whole website they created that was up for less than a year. Unfortunately, like if you want a crosswalk, you know, submit your design or whatever. That's all gone. And now there's this kind of revanche. I mean, you know, this response of like, no, if we didn't come up with it, it's a bad idea. And I think that's a real step backwards. And again, just an unforced PR error.
All right. So I'm going to take a little different opinion of this. I am not a massive fan of, as a person who rides a motorcycle and a bicycle 90% of the time, I am not a fan of people who decide to paint on a street, generally speaking, especially if they're using substandard paint, because it could be quite more slippery than regular paint. So that's not any good. But two, I don't like the idea of folks deciding on their own. I mean, I understand, I get it, unsafe intersections, and trust me, I am highly reactive as a person who's on his bicycle all the time, highly reactive to bad drivers and also bad cyclists in Seattle, because there's plenty of both. But I would say that I'm not a big fan of people who deciding where they are going to. And I know actually a couple of people who did exactly this, and I completely understand why they did it, the guerrilla sidewalk, the guerrilla crosswalk thing. I understand why they did it. What I don't understand in this whole dynamic is why, when we switch to district council elections, why there isn't a mechanism to contact your council member from your neighborhood and have a pathway for getting this solved. And I agree. I mean, I'm having dealt personally in a business with SDOT as well as a reporter with SDOT. It's not an organization or an agency that frequently, I think, has a history of listening to people as well as it should. And I would say that the people who are making the case for crosswalks in areas probably are making very good cases for it. But I'm still not a fan of random members of the public deciding to put new lines on a street that may not actually make anything any safer at all. And in fact, it may make it less safe in some circumstances, especially because every intersection, effectively, like we've said, is a crosswalk. I mean, I know when I'm riding and when I'm driving, I'm looking at every intersection. I'm not just looking at intersections where those are painted.
Well, as a frequent pedestrian, I mean, I know and again, like, yeah, I haven't done a 5-year study on this, which is what SDOT would probably propose. But I know that people are more likely to stop in crosswalks that have flashing lights and painted crosswalks than
Certainly
ones
the
where
flashing lights, I would agree with you.
But then one where I'm just standing there. And, you know, I mean, I think there was a mechanism to your point about districts. Now, SDOT is a mayoral responsibility, so that it doesn't answer to the city council. But there was a program called Your Voice, Your Choice, where you could apply for funds essentially as a neighborhood. The city cut funding for that program and it is gone. So that mechanism is not available to people anymore. And so I think that people, you know, there were bike lanes that were created this way in the city, with people doing tactical urbanism, putting up, you know, obstacles to keep cars from hitting them. And we got to remember, I mean, the city has a goal of Vision Zero, no traffic deaths or serious injuries, and we are going in the wrong direction. More people are dying.
It's actually worse since the Vision Zero program.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a real problem here.
Okay. Well, I wonder how many more guerrilla crosswalks will pop up just because of this discussion.
That's the thing. I mean, that's what I mean by an unforced error. I think that this is going to prompt more of this.
Where's the limit?
I think you're probably right.
All right. And not all of us are endorsing that eventuality. We need to take another short break, and then we've got lots of stuff to do before the show vanishes on us. So quick break and more Week in Review when we come right back.
Support for KUOW comes from Puget Sound Psychotherapy and Psychiatry, offering treatment for anxiety, stress, and depression, and medication management tailored to meet clients' specific needs. Appointments currently available. More information at pspseattle.com.
I'm Paul Henley, host of BBC NewsHour. On today's programme, why agreement on payments from rich countries to poorer ones is holding up the end of the COP27 climate summit, and why Sweden confirms foul play on the Nord Stream gas pipeline.
Stick around for BBC NewsHour right after Week in Review on 94.9 KUOW Seattle.
Support for KUOW comes from Amazon, partnering with Mary's Place and the Mary's Place Family Center located at Amazon's Seattle campus. The shelter includes an on-site health clinic and computer labs for job searches and aims to help families move to permanent housing.
Okay, KOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke. We've got Geekwire's Mike Lewis, Insiders Katherine Long, Publicola's Erica Barnett. We've only got 8 minutes left in the show. We haven't said any election updates yet. And by the way, Congress member almost elect Marie Gluesenkamp Perez will be on stage with me for our annual Year in Review show. So that's December 15th at McCaw Hall. Details and tickets at kuow.org/events. Yes, Gluesenkamp Perez is still invited, even though I say almost elect because the count's not official yet. The news media say cannot catch up, but the media don't choose our representatives. Okay, so we'll see. More on the Year in Review show in a moment. But what do we know about election results? Ranked choice voting is closer to being approved, but still not right. Not yet in Seattle. Is that right?
I think the ranked choice voting campaign may have already declared victory a couple days ago or yesterday.
I think so. Yeah, that's what I'd read.
Yeah, I mean it's looking.
Well,
looking
it's
pretty
not
certain.
the media,
I
and
know.
it's not the campaigns that choose this. Okay, so that's the idea that Seattleites will be able to choose, not just fill the bubble for one candidate, but maybe say this is my first, third, second, third, fourth, fifth favorite candidates.
Well, remember what we talked about on this very show not that long ago. What are we going to end up with ranked choice voting? Remember this conversation?
Yes.
With Joni Balter?
Yes. She thought it was a problem in search of a solution.
Well, no.
A solution.
I think
in
what
search
we
of a problem.
settled on is that what's going to get elected to Seattle City Council. I made the point that when it comes to you draw a comparison with beer, that
you're right.
that Manny's Pale Ale made by Georgetown Brewing is sort of everyone's kind of third favorite beer. I mean, I like it. It's This is no criticism of Georgetown. Wonderful people, fantastic beer, but it's kind of everyone's third. And so I would watch, as a guy who spends a lot of time, in a bar, I would watch people sort of at a table settle on Manny's because they couldn't all agree on the same thing, but everyone kind of liked it. And so my argument is that effectively this is going to be, I kind of like it as an idea that this is a way for a lot of people to get some of what they want. And anyone here at the table who is involved in any level of personal relationship, either a marriage or, family or whatnot, has been making these compromises all of their life. I think this is just reflecting our personal lives when we go to ranked choice voting.
That's how I'm going to go home and describe my marriage. Ranked choice voting.
Manny's Pale Ale.
You were my third favorite.
You were third favorite.
Okay.
And but you were also their third favorite. Remember that.
Right. Good point. That's romantic. U.S. Senator Patty Murray got elected, as she always does. She's won like 6 times, and she's not just another U.S. senator. Why is it a big deal that she's the Senate President pro tem?
Well, second one from Washington State, Warren Magnuson. If you've ever been to Magnuson Park or any number of other things in Seattle named after Warren Magnuson, senator until 1981 from Washington State. So the second time we've had President pro tem, which means you're third in line for the presidency. But the other thing that's the bigger part of this whole matter is you're now head of the Senate Appropriations Committee. Right. And if you're head of the Senate Appropriations Committee, that means you are helping direct where billions and billions and billions of federal dollars are headed. Like you were, I think, referenced in an email, like it's pork when other people get it and necessary projects when you get it.
Yes,
right?
That's right.
And that is the type of thing. I mean, famously in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, Warren Magnuson and Scoop Jackson, another senator from Washington State, as a two-headed monster, directed enormous sums of money here for Boeing, for the University of Washington, for a variety of things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, can Patty Murray do that as appropriations chair? I don't know, but she's certainly better able to do that than she was prior.
Okay,
I think it's a really interesting development.
She's third in line for presidency. We're first in line for the pork.
Bingo.
Okay, Erica, when is a building historic? Is it just because it's old, or is it because it's special? Tell us about this building on Capitol Hill, and it's not alone.
Yeah, there's a building that I think is most commonly known as the Jaitai building for its longest tenant. Jaitai, I think, just is closing as of this week.
A comedy club in there too.
Yeah, Angel Thai before that. That's as far back as I go.
Yeah.
But basically in Seattle, if a building is 25 years old or older, which now is 1997, you guys, it can be nominated as historic based on a number of different criteria. This one was up for nomination. It was not nominated this week, but it's a 2-story building that is going to probably be torn down now for 100 completely affordable, or well, not completely affordable. Let me take that back. 100% affordable apartments, and 100 of them. There was an argument that this building is historic based on its architect, who is a guy named Henry Dozier, who has a real checkered history that I talk about on Publicola this week, and also a lot of salacious 125-year-old gossip, if you're into that. And it was nominated based on the fact that, yeah, basically it's old. It's an old building that was part of the Broadway Strip around the turn of the last century. It looked a lot like a lot of the other buildings. There was a home for pregnant women there, like many other homes of its sort at the time. And so a couple of Landmark Board members argued that this made it notable, and the rest of the Landmark Board disagreed, which is kind of unusual in Seattle. I mean, Seattle likes to landmark buildings that are not particularly remarkable.
Yeah,
we don't have a lot of
it,
history here.
Catherine, so you would describe this building as
cosmically blah was, I think, my reaction when I went and looked up this building. Yeah. Speaking of buildings that we don't like landmarking, there was a building near my house that's up for landmark nomination in 2019, the Crescent Apartments, I believe. It is possibly the most interesting landmarks nomination review board committee meeting ever to happen. It was described variously as a prison, as an alien spaceship, and as a place where you would never want to spend any part of your life.
Landmarks nomination meetings are almost always really interesting, I think. I mean, I remember the one for the Denny's up in Ballard.
Sure.
Where,
historic.
Which was, an example of, and I think Skip Berger, who's on this program frequently, would describe it as a great example of Googie architecture.
Googie?
Googie. Yeah, which is a
I
whole West Coast thing. It's very interesting. But I liked it because it was one of the only 24-hour places in Ballard where I lived at the time. This is back in, I want to say, like 2003, when there wasn't a lot going on in Ballard, but that also did not get landmarked, and it was ultimately demolished. And now there's a Five Guys there.
I only have time. We have a minute left, and I yes. Do you have something to leave listeners with? We always end it with a smile.
I was just going to agree with everyone.
Oh, well, that would make me smile if you guys weren't fighting. So that would be, No,
good. I mean, I think that the landmark thing most of the time in Seattle seems to have been used to prevent development, frequently to prevent density.
Yes.
It's always been a tool for that. And it seems to me like this is not anything different, what's going on in Capitol Hill.
Yeah. If you don't want it to be developed into something new, then what it is
historic.
Maybe cosmically blah, but it's historical. Okay, we got to go. And we always, we end the show week in review with what's making you smile. We do the same thing every December on our onstage year in review show. And so I'm telling you this because we end with your voicemails every year telling us what made you smile this year. So if you leave us a voicemail, the number is 206-616-3248. Give us a call and tell us something that made you smile in 2022. And we can play it on stage and on the air. 206-616-3248. And we are truly out of time, except for me to say that I've loved having Insider Tech correspondent Katherine Long, Publicola co-founder and editor Erica Barnett, and Geekwire contributing editor Mike Lewis on the show this week. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you.
Thanks, Phil.
By the way, information about that year in review event, it's December 15th. You can find out all about it at kuow.org/events. I'm Bill Radke. Kevin Kniestedt produces the show with social media and live streaming help from Juan Pablo Chiquiza and Tio Popescu. Bernard Ouellette runs the board. Thanks for listening. We're going to take next week off on account of Thanksgiving, and we'll see you